Exercise 23. Talk 1. Listen to part of a talk by a college professor.
The first few pages of the syllabus are an outline of the topics for each session. As you can see, you'll be responsible for reading the material before you come to class, so you'll have enough background to be able to follow the lecture. For example, on September 3rd, when you come to class, you should already have read the first 2 chapters in the text, so we can discuss the history of psychology in that session. The following week, you should have a grasp of chapters 3 and 4, so we can cover biology and the psychology of the brain, and so on. Now, let's take a few minutes to look at the policies and procedures listed on page 3 of the course syllabus. Refer to the section under Assignments first, please. You'll notice that all assignments must be typewritten and submitted on the due date in order for you to receive full credit, and the grade for a late assignment will be lowered by 1 letter for each day past the due date. Now look at the section under Examinations. As you see, all exams must be completed on the dates and times scheduled in the syllabus. If you must be absent, for an exam, then try to call me to let me know what your problem is. My office phone is on the syllabus, and my home phone is listed in the telephone directory. Of course, email is best, and you have my email address on page 1. It's right under my name on the syllabus. A make-up exam must be arranged within 1 week of the scheduled date of the exam. And I must warn you, the questions on the make-up will not be the same as the questions on the regular exam. In fact, I usually give multiple choice tests, but I always give short answer tests for make-ups. And my students tell me they say the make-ups are quite a bit more difficult than the regularly scheduled exams. Oh yes, let's take a minute to clarify my attendance policy. I suggest that you come to class. I'll be assigning you a seat. Yes, I know you'd rather choose your own seat, but this is a large class, and it would take up too much time to call the roll every session. So I'll just mark those people absent who aren't present in their seats by the time the class begins. Better late than never, but if you're late, you'd better check in with me after class so I can change my attendance records. Remember that attendance is 15% of the grade, which usually makes the difference between an A and a B or a B and a C. Let's not even talk about D's and F's. One more thing. If you need to request an incomplete, please remember that I only approve them for illness or for a serious personal problem, not just because you ran out of time. And you must submit a request form with a signed statement of explanation to my office in order for your incomplete to be considered. Otherwise, you'll have to register and take the entire course over again to get credit.
Number 1. What is the main purpose of this talk? Two. What is the speaker's policy for late assignments? 3. What is the professor's attendance policy? 4. What is the procedure for a student to receive a grade of incomplete? 5. Listen again to part of the talk, then answer the question.
Better late than never, but if you're late, you'd better check in with me after class so I can change my attendance records. Remember that attendance is 15% of the grade, which usually makes the difference between an A and a B or a B and a C.
Why does the professor say this?
Remember that attendance is 15% of the grade,
6. What can we infer about the speaker? Talk 2. Listen to part of a class clarification by a professor.
I've been getting quite a few emails with questions about grading for the group project, so let me clarify that before we start class today. Each group has 5 members in it, except one group that has 6. The group project includes a presentation and a written report, but I'll be giving you 3 grades and averaging them for a final grade on the project. First, I'll be grading the written report as a whole, and every member of the group will receive the same grade on the written report. So it'll be to your benefit to divide the work and produce the best report you can. How do you divide the work? Well, in the past, some of my students have actually divided the report into sections, and each group member has written one of the sections. That's certainly a possibility, especially for groups who may have a problem finding mutual meeting times. But some of the other groups have assigned tasks to the group members. For example, 2 members might do the research, 2 members might write the report, and another member might provide editing and formatting of the final draft. In my experience, it's been difficult for a group of 5 or 6 people to do the actual writing line by line, but I have had a few groups do it that way. So you can see that you have a lot of flexibility in how to prepare the report. However, remember that everyone will receive the same grade for it. That brings us to the second grade, which is a group grade for the presentation. Again, I suggest that you share the labor here. If you have a group member who's artistic, you could capitalize on that talent, maybe by having posters, overheads, or visuals as part of the presentation. If you have an excellent speaker, someone who likes presenting, that person might be responsible for the majority of the oral presentation. Another person who writes well but prefers not to speak could prepare the handout if you choose to provide one. I think you see what I mean. The best way to get a high grade is to play to the strength of every group member. I mean that you shouldn't ask someone to perform a task that is outside his or her unique ability. And remember, everyone has the potential to contribute something to the group. But about the grade, again, there will be 1 grade for the group presentation, and everyone will receive the same grade. The major problem for previous groups, and I'll alert you to it right now, is preparing too much material for the time frame. Remember, you have 30 minutes, and that might seem like a lot of time, but many groups haven't been able to complete their presentations, and of course, they have had points deducted because of it. So, what about the third grade? This is an individual grade based on your contribution to the group. I'll be asking you to prepare a list of your activities as a group member, and I'll be giving you a grade based on participation. Let me explain that a little more. Let's say that one group member has an impressive list. How will I know that it's accurate? Not that anyone in this class would exaggerate, but to be as fair as possible, your list will not be complete without I'll be asking for the signatures of every group member, verifying that your list is appropriate for the work you've done. Then, you see, I can evaluate your performance on an individual basis. So, I'll have the 3 grades, and I'll add them together and average them to give you a total grade. I found that this system discourages hitchhikers. By that I mean someone who belongs to the group but doesn't contribute to the group. Let's say I have a group member with a grade of A for the group report, a grade of A for the group presentation, but a grade of D for the participation. Then that student will have a B or even a C for the final grade, whereas someone in the same group who has an A for participation will have an A for the final grade. I think that makes the grading a little more fair.
Number 1. What is the purpose of this talk? Two, how will the written report be graded? Three, how will the final grade be calculated for each student? Four, how will the professor know what each individual has contributed? Five, listen again to part of the talk, then answer the question.
How do you divide the work? Well, in the past, some of my students have actually divided the report into sections, and each group member has written one of the sections.
Why does the professor ask this?
How do you divide the work?
Six, why does the professor most probably use such a complicated grading system? Exercise 24, Talk 1. Listen to part of a lecture in a history class. The professor will discuss gold coins.
In 1792, Congress passed an act authorizing the coinage of gold eagles valued at $10, half eagles valued at $5, and quarter eagles valued at $2.50. These gold coins were standardized to silver on a 15-to-1 ratio, that is, 15 ounces of silver to 1 ounce of gold. Although the ratio was reasonable at the time that the bill was passed, by the turn of the century, the ratio in Europe had reached 15 3/4 to 1, and the overvalued gold coins in the United States were either smuggled out of the country or melted down. Gold therefore disappeared from circulation until 1834, when a new law reduced the weight of gold pieces. Soon afterward, gold coins appeared in a smaller size and returned to circulation. The new interest and demand for gold encouraged the mint to strike $20 double eagles and a smaller number of $50 gold coins. The financial uncertainty during the Great Depression of 1929 encouraged hoarding of gold coins by individuals, a situation that became so serious that the government finally ordered all gold coins to be turned in. During the next several years, a number of amendments exempted certain kinds of gold coins and allowed limited collecting. Since then, the interest in collecting gold coins has increased, and the restrictions have decreased. Now there are no restrictions regarding the export, import, purchase, sale, or collecting of gold coins in the United States.
Number 1. What is the main topic of this talk? Two, what was the value of the original gold eagle? Three, what was the value of silver to gold in 1792? Four, what happened after the law of 1834? Five, what are the restrictions on collecting gold coins today? Talk 2. Listen to part of a lecture in a music appreciation class. The professor is discussing the work of Stephen Foster.
Stephen Foster was one of the most prolific songwriters of his time, contributing more than 200 songs during his 20-year career. His first attempt when he was 14 was a forgettable composition called the Tioga Waltz, a melody for 3 flutes which debuted at a school exhibition. His first published piece appeared only 3 years later in 1844. It was called Open Thy Lattice, Love, and it was rather typical of the sentimental tunes of the time. Still, it was a good effort for a 17-year-old composer. But it was minstrel music for which Foster will always be remembered. The songs of Southern black slaves in the pre-Civil War days evoked nostalgic themes, like the plantation era that was already fated to pass into history. His first successful piece, O Susanna, became popular throughout the world and is still widely sung. Campton Races followed with similar success. The most successful song written by an American to that date was Stephen Foster's Old Folks at Home, which appeared in 1851. Some of you may recall it as Way Down Upon the Swanee River, since it was also referred to by that title as well. In any case, an item in the musical world of New York stressed the unprecedented sales. At a time when half of all the sheet music published was a total failure and a sale of 5,000 copies was considered highly successful, Old Folks at Home sold nearly 100,000 copies. Old Kentucky Home, which came out 2 years later, capitalized on the reputation that Foster was making for himself and was also a huge seller. Now, what is interesting about the success of Stephen Foster is that he himself was ambivalent about it. Sometimes he hid his identity with pseudonyms. Sometimes he requested that his name be withheld from the cover to the sheet music. And other times he insisted that his name be displayed. Out of the context of the times, none of this seems to make sense. But when we contrast the musical world of high society with that of the common people, it becomes clear. Stephen Foster's success came from writing plantation songs for popular entertainment. The music was easy to remember, very repetitious, and available to everyone in the popular music halls. But the music that was considered serious and appropriate for society events was quite different. Foster proved that he could write such music, and perhaps had some secret desire to succeed on those terms, but that type of music didn't enjoy the widespread popularity of the plantation melodies that we still recognize today. Most school children have heard Jeannie with the Light Brown Hair and Beautiful Dreamer, but none would recognize the saccharine ballads and hymns that were considered by a genteel few his better music.
Number 1. What kind of music is associated with Stephen Foster? Two. Which piece was the most successful song written by an American? Three. Why did Stephen Foster withhold his name from the cover to some of his sheet music? Four. What best describes Stephen Foster's most popular songs? Five. What do we know about Stephen Foster? Exercise 25. Talk 1. Listen to part of a lecture in a psychology class. The professor will discuss heredity and environment.
Good morning. I trust that you have all read the assignment and that we can proceed with today's lecture. As you know from your text, both heredity and environment play a role in the development of the personality. In addition, research at the University of Texas at Arlington has shown that the order of one's birth in relationship to brothers and sisters may be a significant factor. Those born first tend to develop personality traits that make them domineering, ambitious, and highly motivated to achieve. And the same is true for only children. In contrast, children born later in the family tend to be more socially adept, likable, talkative individuals. Also interesting in the research is the fact that a woman with older brothers and a man with older sisters seem to be able to interact more easily with the opposite sex. Having older opposite-sex siblings seems to be important in being able to establish social relationships with members of the opposite sex. There is also some evidence that the youngest child may develop a very charming personality in order to be included in the activities of the older group. Of course, if the other children are no longer living at home, the youngest child is more likely to develop the characteristics of an only child.
Number 1. What is the main subject of this lecture? Two. What should the students know before they hear this lecture? Three. Which one of the people would probably be the most comfortable interacting with a member of the opposite sex? Four. What personality trait will firstborn children probably exhibit? Five. According to the research, what might be the dominant personality trait of the youngest child? Talk 2. Listen to part of a lecture in an English literature class. The professor will be talking about American writers in the early 19th century.
Today we will discuss the Knickerbocker School, which was a rather informal group of writers who met in New York City during the early 1800s. The name Knickerbocker, let me write that down for you, was a tribute to Diedrich Knickerbocker, a character created by one of their members, the writer Washington Irving. At any one time, about 20 writers belonged to the group, including the three most important figures in early American literature, William Cullen Bryant, the editor of the New York Evening Post, Washington Irving, a well-known poet and storyteller, and novelist James Fenimore Cooper. Although Irving gained recognition in Europe as America's first legitimate man of letters, and his stories Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow were widely published as serials, it was James Fenimore Cooper who achieved success with subjects and settings that were typically American. Cooper created the frontier novel, with a hero who embodied the American frontier spirit. In the Leatherstocking Tales, 5 novels about frontier life, the affable old scout Natty Bumppo evolves into a philosopher and even, some say, an epic hero. Bumppo is a frontiersman who knows how to live close to nature and possesses all the skills necessary for a rugged pioneer existence. But he is also an observer of life. He sees that the settlers are a civilizing influence. He respects the social order that they create. But he also sees the thoughtless and sometimes selfish abuse of the natural environment. The best of all the Leatherstocking tales has to be The Last of the Mohicans, which I believe at least some of you have seen on video. You may recall that the story recounts the conflict between the French and the English during the early years of independence, with Indians fighting on both sides. I personally feel that this represents some of Cooper's best writing, especially in those passages that recount the death of the Mohican chief's son in a noble attempt to avenge the murder of his love. Of course, there were others who had membership in the Knickerbocker School, but if you are familiar with the three major writers that we have discussed today, you'll have a feel for early American literature.
Number 1. What is the main focus of this talk? Two. What are the Leatherstocking tales? 3. What kind of character is Natty Bumppo? 4. Who was one of the most important members of the Knickerbocker School? 5. Which of the following best describes James Fenimore Cooper? Exercise 26. Talk 1. Listen to part of a lecture in a biology class.
The concept of a half-life is mentioned in your textbook, but I'm going to take a few minutes to discuss it with you. The method is called radiometric dating. Okay, physicists use the term half-life to describe the average time it takes for half of a group of radioactive isotopes to undergo decay. Toefl and Hazen have an excellent analogy. It's in the chapter assigned for next week. Okay, they compare the group of isotopes to a batch of microwave popcorn. If you watch one kernel in the batch, it'll pop at a specific time. But all the kernels don't pop at the same time. And although you can't predict the exact time that the one kernel will pop, you do know for how many minutes to set the microwave, because you can predict the amount of time necessary for the batch. Okay, to get back to the radioactive nuclei, some nuclei will decay immediately, while others will take much longer. The important thing is that the percentage of nuclei that decay in each second remains more or less constant. Okay, let's go back to that definition. Remember, a half-life is the average time that it takes for half of the group to undergo decay. So let's just use 100 nuclei as an example. And if it takes 30 minutes for 50 of them to undergo radioactive decay, then the half-life of that nucleus is 30 minutes. And if we continue observing for another 30 minutes, you'll have half of the 50, or 25, that have decayed, leaving you 25. Okay, and at the end of 30 more minutes, you'll have 12 or 13, and so on and so on. But this is why the popcorn example that Toefl and Hazen came up with is so useful. If a nucleus has a half-life of 30 minutes, all the nuclei won't wait half an hour before they all begin to decay. They don't all decay at the same moment. Each one will decay at a different moment, like the popcorn. A half-life of 30 minutes means that on the average, an individual nucleus will take 30 minutes to decay. Okay, this is the interesting part. Since the half-life is relatively easy to measure, it's a very useful tool in determining the age of both natural and man-made materials. The method is called radiometric dating, or since the isotope carbon-14 is the most commonly used nucleus, you may hear the term carbon-14 dating. But that isn't really accurate since many different isotopes can be used in the process, not just carbon-14. Anyway, let's turn our attention to carbon to see why the dating system is so effective and why carbon-14 is such a good choice for dating fossils. Every living organism uses carbon. Right now, you're using carbon from the food you ate earlier, and through a series of complex processes, you're turning it into living tissue. Plants take in carbon dioxide from the air, so I think you can agree that carbon is essential to all living things. Okay, most of the carbon is carbon-12, probably close to 99%, and the other 1% is almost all carbon-13. But there's a minuscule amount of carbon-14. That's the important one for the purposes of dating because carbon-14 has a half-life of approximately 5,700 years. Now remember that all living things are taking in carbon all the time, including carbon-14. But at the point of death, the carbon begins to decay. In radiometric dating, we can determine the age of wood or bone or other materials that have once been alive by measuring the carbon-14 that remains in comparison with the amount that we know must have been present when it was a living plant or animal. And that's pretty exciting. But of course, carbon-14 can go back in time only about 50,000 years until the amount of carbon is so small that it's no longer a useful measure to date geological formations like rocks and minerals. So, what about rocks that are millions or even billions of years old? Well, the same process can be applied, but we have to use isotopes that have longer half-lives. For example, uranium-238 with a half-life of about 4.5 billion years, or even rubidium-87 with a half-life of almost 50 billion years. So, most of the dates that we'll refer to in this class will have been determined by the use of radiometric dating using carbon-14, since we'll be dealing with living organisms. But it's important for you to understand that the method has application in other sciences that don't treat carbon-based life forms. Okay, any questions so far?
Number 1. What is the main topic of this lecture? Two. What is the definition of a half-life? 3. Why does the professor mention popcorn? 4. What do we know about carbon-14? 5. Listen again to part of the talk. Then answer the question.
So, what about rocks that are millions or even billions of years old? Well, the same process can be applied, but we have to use isotopes that have longer half-lives.
Why does the professor ask this question?
So, what about rocks that are millions or even billions of years old?
Six. Which of the following would not be dated using carbon-14? 2. Listen to a lecture in an anthropology class.
Evidence of systematic planning, now called city planning, has been uncovered during archaeological excavations of ancient cities from as early as 3,500 BC. It isn't surprising, is it, that the locations of these cities have revealed certain basic requirements for life in ancient times, including not only the necessities of water and arable land, but also the requirement of a strategic fortification against invaders. By about 3000 BC, cities along the Indus Valley had regular patterns of streets. Houses with shared walls were built around courtyards, with differences in the height of the house and the width of the street as outward indications of social rank among inhabitants. At about the same time in Pompeii, a central marketplace was already in evidence, with a regular pattern of streets and sidewalks extending out from the commercial area. Less than 1,000 years later, Egyptian cities were being built with parallel streets. In contrast with the Greek cities on the mainland, colonial cities incorporated a gridiron pattern for streets, and by that I mean a pattern of square blocks. Rome itself was somewhat haphazard at the time, but again, Roman colonies and military camps were being built in gridiron patterns throughout what is now Europe. In China and Japan, a central commercial area was in evidence in cities from this time period. The marketplace, in fact, was the most universal feature of cities throughout the ancient world. Now I'm going to skip ahead to the Middle Ages, which was the second interesting historic period in city planning. About the 10th century, heavily fortified garrisons were replaced by towns of a few thousand inhabitants. The towns were only about 1 square mile in size, and many were located in strategic areas near rivers or along the sea coast, where larger cities would later flourish. But in spite of the earlier examples of organized grid patterns from the Roman Empire, the streets in these small towns, the streets were narrow and winding, often projecting out in an arbitrary way from a public square that was often built around a church or a mosque. Gated walls usually surrounded the city, and a custom house for the collection of tolls was almost always constructed on a conspicuous site. Let me see. That brings us to the Renaissance. The Renaissance began near the end of the Middle Ages and continued into the 1600s. It was a period in city planning in which huge plazas were erected to overcome the overcrowding of the earlier towns in order to accommodate burgeoning populations and new modes of transportation. Cities were planned with wide boulevards, spacious parks, and symmetrical, ordered streets. It is in this period that we start to see intricate patterns of circles with diagonals radiating out like the spokes in a wheel. And this was popular, especially in Europe. Moving into the 1700s and 1800s, which roughly correspond to the Industrial Revolution, the towns that had been planned for 2,000 inhabitants became very overcrowded as people moved into the urban areas to work in factories. In North America and Europe, the streets that had been designed for pedestrians and horses were much too narrow, and sanitation became a major concern near the factories, where workers were crowding into dirty, noisy neighborhoods. Although governments tried to regulate housing, in many cases proposing the separation of housing from industrial zones, city planning could simply not keep pace with the migration of workers from rural areas to urban centers. City planning in the 19th and 20th centuries has been chiefly a response to the need to improve living conditions in overcrowded urban areas. And by that I mean not only a city, but also, more recently, sprawling suburbs. The mass production of automobiles after World War I made cars a viable means of transportation for a larger segment of the population and open up areas beyond the immediate downtown for residential use. The need for streets to accommodate more and more vehicles has been one of the modern-day challenges. And a movement called the Garden City Plan, which was exported from Britain to the former colonies, the plan called for public land and buildings to serve as a green belt. And this was an attempt to limit the urban sprawl that was characteristic of this period. In Europe, after World War II, the reconstruction of cities devastated by bombing necessitated even more attention to the concept of city planning. Do we still have a few minutes? Let's go to the modern period of city planning. Today there are three types of cities. The decentralized metropolitan city in developed nations with high automobile ownership, like metropolitan areas in the United States, and the centralized and heavily planned metro areas in European nations, Singapore and Japan, where land is limited and the high cost of fuel discourages suburban living, and densely populated cities in nations where automobile ownership is still out of reach for most people, like some areas in Latin America where we see new towns springing up on the fringes of cities almost overnight. I know I went over that rather quickly, but I advise you to refer to the three types of cities in your book. It's an important concept.
Number 1. What is this lecture mainly about? Two. What feature of ancient cities appears throughout most of the world? Three. When were symmetrical streets with circular patterns introduced? Four. What was the problem for city planners during the Industrial Revolution? Five. Listen again to part of the talk. Then answer the question.
I know I went over that rather quickly, but I advise you to refer to the three types of cities in your book. It's an important concept.
Why does the professor say this?
I advise you to refer to the three types of cities in your book.
Six. Classify each of these cities, matching them with their type. Exercise 27. Talk 1. Listen to part of a discussion in an education class.
I'm sorry. I just don't agree with you at all.
Look, take the example of an international student applying for university admission. If the student has a 250 on the Toefl or an 80 on the Michigan test, most admissions officers will accept the applicant. The student with a 247 or 79 won't be considered. The officer won't even look at transcripts.
Right, but I think that proves my point, not yours.
How?
Well, it's the admissions officer who decides how to use the test. The Toefl and the Michigan are good English proficiency tests, but that's all they are. And English proficiency is necessary for success in an American university. But so are several other factors, including good academic preparation.
Good academic preparation is more important.
Maybe. I don't really know. But what I'm trying to explain to you is that admissions officers should use the proficiency test as one of many considerations. And as such, they really shouldn't insist on a rigid cutoff score like 250 or 80.
Isn't this the basic disagreement? That Paul thinks the tests are bad in themselves, and Sally believes that the tests are good, but that many people don't use them for their intended purpose.
I don't agree with having the tests, Professor Ayers, and that's my position.
But Paul, what would you do to evaluate the English proficiency of a student 10,000 miles away without a standardized test?
I admit, that's a big problem.
It sure is.
Okay, class. For Wednesday, let's consider the problem of evaluation without standardized tests like the Toefl, the SAT, GMAT, and GRE. Paul says that there ought to be an alternative. Sally doesn't seem to believe that there is an appropriate alternative. Please bring in your ideas and suggestions, and we'll discuss them.
Number 1. What do the speakers mainly discuss? Two, what is Paul's opinion about the Toefl and the Michigan test? Three, what does Sally say about the admissions officers? Four, how does the professor handle the disagreement? Five, where did this discussion most probably take place? Talk 2. Listen to part of a discussion in a linguistics class.
Since so many of you have asked me about how to learn a language, I thought it might be useful to take some class time today to discuss it. Betty, you speak several languages, don't you?
Yes, I speak Spanish and French.
And what helped you most in learning those languages?
What helped me most? Well, I studied both languages in high school, and I'm still studying Spanish here at the university. But I think that travel has probably been the most help to me. You see, I've been lucky in that I've lived in Europe, and believe me, I didn't speak very well before I moved there.
You're right, Betty. After studying a language, practice is very useful. When you live in a country where the language is spoken, it's ideal. But you know, sometimes it's difficult to make friends in a new place, even when the people are very friendly.
Yes, I know what you mean, especially if you don't speak the language too well. I had some problems when I first moved to Europe.
And, of course, some people are shy.
That's true.
Professor Baker, whether or not I'm living in a country where the language is spoken, I always go to movies, and whenever I can, I watch TV or listen to the radio in the language I'm trying to learn.
Me too. And reading is another good way to learn. Books are good, but I think that newspapers and magazines are even better.
Probably the best way to learn is to combine all of these ideas. Traveling, talking with people, going to movies, watching TV, listening to the radio, and reading books, newspapers, and magazines. What do you think?
I agree with that, Professor Baker.
So do I, but I don't believe that it's possible to take advantage of practice opportunities without some knowledge of the language first.
Sure. First, it's a good idea to study grammar, vocabulary.
And listening, perhaps even reading.
Then practice is very, very helpful.
Number 1. What do the speakers mainly discuss? Two, why does Professor Baker begin the discussion by calling on Betty? Three, 3. What helped Betty most in learning Spanish? 4. 5. What does Sally say about the Toefl and the Michigan test? 6. 7. 8. 9. 10. 11. 12. 13. 14. 15. 16. 17. 18. 19. 20. 21. 22. 23. 24. 25. 26. 27. 28. 29. 30. 31. 32. 33. 34. 35. 36. 37. 38. 39. 40. 41. 42. 43. 44. 45. 46. 47. 48. 49. 50. 51. 52. 53. 54. 55. 56. 57. 58. 59. 60. 61. 62. 63. 64. 65. 66. 67. 68. 69. 70. 71. 72. 73. 74. 75. 76. 77. 78. 79. 80. 81. 82. 83. 84. 85. 86. 87. 88. 89. 90. 91. 92. 93. 94. 95. 96. 97. 98. 99. 100. 101. 102. 103. 104. 105. 106. 107. 108. 109. 110. 111 4. What is Professor Baker's opinion? 5. How can we best describe Professor Baker? Exercise 28, Talk 1. Listen to part of a seminar in an art class.
Let me remind you that this is a seminar, so I won't be lecturing. This is a discussion format, and that means that I expect you to respond to the reading assignments. No need to raise your hand. Just be moderately courteous about taking turns. Remember that 30% of your grade is based on class participation, okay? Now, with that in mind, let's begin our discussion of Chapter 22 in the main textbook. What is pop art?
I'll start. Pop art, as I understand it, was a movement that began in the early 60s when painters, I think it was mostly painters, began to use commercial objects like bottles, comic strips, cigarette packages, and like that as subjects for their art.
Okay, so I'll ask the obvious question. Why paint these objects when they're everywhere?
Well, first, let me mention that although there were several artists who were associated with the pop movement, it's probably Andy Warhol whose paintings best represent it. And I believe Warhol had a response for that question. I think he said, everything is art, everything is beautiful.
Yes, he did say that. I'm glad you mentioned it. So let's focus on Warhol for a few minutes. There are some examples of his work on page 524 of your textbook. As you see, he painted enormous Campbell's soup cans, lines of Coca-Cola bottles, and rows of Martinson coffee cans. Any ideas about these particular subjects?
Well, of course, the story is that Warhol actually ate soup for lunch every day for 20 years, so when he decided to paint objects in the environment, then the soup can naturally came to mind. Do you think that's true, Dr. Stevens?
Tom, it certainly is a widespread myth, but probably closer to reality is the fact that Warhol was once a commercial artist and that it was a logical transition for him personally to paint products. He went from commercial ads to art, that gave expression to the same kinds of objects. But he painted people, too. Any thoughts on that?
Well, he painted faces, actually. Huge images of the celebrities of the 60s. There were several of Marilyn Monroe and Elvis Presley.
And at least one of Jacqueline Kennedy. But I was thinking that they really weren't portraits in the strictest sense.
That's interesting. What do you mean?
I'm not sure, but besides the giant canvases, the way that they were presented, it also had a commercial feel. I don't know. I'm not saying that too well.
No, I think you're onto something. Do you mean perhaps that the people are commercialized in a sense, like a brand name?
Exactly. I think the book identified the subjects in the Face series as popular icons. That was it, of the 60s. So maybe their faces do have commercial appeal.
Yes, and he wasn't very flattering, was he?
No, he wasn't. What do you think about the colors?
That's what I mean. Sometimes the colors are almost psychedelic. Again, that's very retro, very 60s.
Let's go back to one of the Marilyn Monroe paintings in your book. Let me see. Here it is. Turn to page 526. You can't see it very well here, but on the original, the paint actually gives the impression of colored ink, and there's often a black stencil over it, which produces a unique effect. See how the orange background contrasts with the yellow hair, and there's a pink and a purple tone on the face? Then there's this green eyeshadow, and to me, it looks like he stenciled the black over the flat surfaces of the face. It's not a lovely portrait, and the critics agreed with you, Julia. Some critics even called it grotesque, but It is absolutely original.
Original but dated, don't you think? I mean, years from now, will anyone be eating Campbell's soup or drinking Coca-Cola? Or really, for that matter, will anyone remember Marilyn Monroe?
Interesting observation. So, Tom, you're saying that since pop art, since it depends on the popular culture, which by its very nature is transient, you're asking, will the subject matter of the pop art movement doom its artists to temporary recognition?
Exactly, which I'm thinking is really different from, well, unlike a painter who chooses to create landscapes, which don't change.
Number 1. What is this session mainly about? Two. According to the lecturer, why did Warhol paint objects in the environment? Three. Whose faces did Warhol paint? Four. What problem does Tom mention? Five. Listen again to part of the talk, then answer the question.
I mean, years from now, will anyone be eating Campbell's soup or drinking Coca-Cola? Or really, for that matter, will anyone remember Marilyn Monroe?
Interesting observation. So, Tom, you're saying that since pop art, since it depends on the popular culture, which by its very nature is transient, you're asking, will the subject matter of the pop art movement doom its artists to temporary recognition?
Why does the professor say this?
So, Tom, you're saying that since pop art, since it depends on the popular culture, which by its very nature is transient, you're asking, will the subject matter of the pop art movement doom its artists to temporary recognition?
Six. Select a drawing that is done in the Andy Warhol style. Talk 2. Listen to part of a lecture in an environmental science class. The professor is discussing the web of life.
To review from yesterday's lecture, ecology is the study of organisms in relation to their environment. The total complex of relationships is referred to as the web of life. Now, you'll remember that when the relationships don't change much from year to year, when they don't change, we observe a balance of nature. Today we'll discuss what occurs when the balance of nature is disturbed, either by a geological change, such as a change of climate, or a local agitation, such as a fire, like the recent forest fire north of here. Now, after the balance of nature has been disturbed, when it's disturbed, a period of rehabilitation must occur, and the first life to appear has traditionally been called pioneer flora and fauna. But the pioneer life is temporary and soon replaced by other forms of life. In turn, these forms are replaced by others. That is, a series of transitional life forms successively appears, preparing the environment for the forms that will replace them.
Excuse me, Dr. Green, would that be what the book refers to as ecological succession?
It is. For example, after a forest fire, pioneer plants will appear, and they are usually herbs or ground cover. Now, soon, they'll be replaced by shrubs. Shrubs will be replaced by trees, and so it goes in succession, which is where we get the term ecological succession. Now, Until very recently, it was assumed that plants and animals would form a climax community, and that's a final stage in the ecological succession, and that tended to be stable for a long time. So, in the case of the forest fire, when a permanent climax flora appeared, we would have assumed that the environment had finally stabilized in balance with the fauna, minerals, and water supply. And the theory was interesting because a climax community, because it usually didn't have the same kinds of plants and animals as the community that had been prevalent before the balance of nature was disturbed. Now, what was essential to the concept of a climax was that the balance of nature permitted the community to continue in spite of other organic competition for the area. But the notion of a stable, symbiotically functioning community has been mostly abandoned by scientists. Currently, we believe that natural ecosystems are much too complex to be neatly organized into predictable stages with a final stable community. So what we can expect in the case of the fire is the emergence of patches of former landscapes, and these patches will be at different stages in the same local environment. Question.
So the patches are in different stages, and that would be a polyclimax condition?
That's exactly right, Mike. Poly means many, so polyclimax refers to adjoining ecosystems at different but mature stages. I believe it's explained as dynamic equilibrium in your text.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Janet?
Yes, I was wondering what your opinion was of that wildfire. You know, the one near here. In the book, it was mentioned that sometimes that fire is now recognized. How did they say it? Fire is a natural part of an ecosystem, and at least some experts have been quoted in news reports that they feel fire prevention strategies may have contributed to that disaster. So, do you agree with that?
I do. That particular ecosystem had an enormous amount of undergrowth, and I think that it may have fueled the fire. Now, in my opinion, if we had purposely burned some of the undergrowth in what we call a cool fire, we would have removed the accumulation of brush that contributed to the destructive hot fire that destroyed more than, I think I read that it was 50,000 acres of wilderness. Yes?
Is a cool fire a controlled burn?
Yes, it's referred to as a controlled burn. But back to your original question. I have to tell you that everyone wouldn't agree with my opinion. Critics call that policy the let it burn policy. Now, of course, many people have let's say, a vested interest in fire suppression. Because so many people have built their homes close to the natural environments, they don't want any fires started in their immediate vicinity. So, like your textbook indicates, it's a very controversial topic.
Number 1. What is the main topic of today's lecture? Two. How does the scientific community view the theory of a stable climax community? 3. According to the lecturer, why is pioneer life important? 4. What is Dr. Green's opinion of a controlled burn? 5. Listen again to part of the talk, then answer the question.
That is, a series of transitional life forms successively appears, preparing the environment for the forms that will replace them.
Excuse me, Dr. Green. Would that be what the book refers to as ecological succession?
Why did the student ask this question?
Would that be what the book refers to as ecological succession?
6. The professor describes the process of ecological succession that occurs after the balance of nature has been disturbed. Summarize the process by putting the events in order. Exercise 29. Talk 1. Listen to part of a lecture in an art class. The professor has been discussing the Art Nouveau school.
By the last quarter of the 19th century, Louis Tiffany had begun experimenting with different methods of adding color to blown glass. Finally, he produced a unique iridescent glass, which he called Tiffany Favril. It was this glass that he shaped and pieced together with metals to form lamps, windows, and other objects of art. This is a typical example of a Tiffany lamp. Look at the way that the pieces are fitted together. You've probably seen one or a reproduction of one at one time or another. From 1890 to about 1920, Tiffany's Favril glass became very popular throughout the world. It regained popularity in the 1960s and is still prized by many glass collectors today. In addition, Tiffany created floral jewelry that was considered very stylish at the turn of the century, rebelling against current fashion that dictated the use of precious stones. Tiffany began working with new materials, creating symbolic, dramatic forms. As a member of the Art Nouveau movement, he tried to create new and unusual pieces with delicate designs and curved lines. Although his name is associated with glass and jewelry today, Tiffany was probably best known during his lifetime for the interior designs that he created. It was Tiffany who was commissioned to design the altar in the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City, and to redecorate the reception rooms in the White House during the administration of President Chester Arthur. The spectacular glass curtain at the National Theater in Mexico City was perhaps his crowning achievement. His estate on Long Island was filled with beautiful furnishings and decorations, many of them designed by Tiffany himself. When it was sold, the proceeds were transferred to the Louis Tiffany Foundation for Art Students to provide scholarships for aspiring artists. The jewelry store on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan that his father had founded still bears the name Tiffany's, and it is still considered a highly fashionable shop for wealthy clientele.
Number 1. What is the main purpose of this lecture? Two. What characterized Tiffany's jewelry? 3. How did Tiffany help aspiring artists? 4. For which interior design was Tiffany not commissioned? 5. Select the example of a Tiffany Favril design. Talk 2. Listen to part of a lecture in a botany class. The professor will discuss cacti.
The cactus is one example of the way that plants adapt to extreme conditions of climate. A cactus, like this one, has the same basic structure as all other plants, but the function of leaves is carried out by the stems and branches of the plant. Here are some more examples of the most familiar cacti, the beryl, the saguaro, and the prickly pear. As you see, they all have stems, branches, or spines, but no leaves. In spring, they may have beautiful blossoms. It is assumed that the predecessors of the modern cactus had leaves, but that during millions of years of changes in the climate resulting in desert conditions, the cactus gradually adapted to the hotter, drier environment. The roots spread out and began to grow closer to the surface so that water could be absorbed more quickly. The roots and spongy or hollow stem of the cactus began to serve as a storage container for water, and the outer layer of the plant developed thick, waxy walls to prevent the water from draining out. Some varieties of cactus actually have ribbed folds that expand and contract depending on the volume of water stored inside the stem. Although there are a few members of the cactus family that retain their leaves, in most cacti they have evolved into spines, needles, or hairs to protect the plant in areas where little green vegetation is available for foraging animals. In cacti without leaves, the stems and branches carry out the nutritive functions that usually take place in the thin-leafed surfaces of other plants.
Number 1. What is the lecture mainly about? Two. What is assumed about cactus plants millions of years ago? Three. According to the lecturer, why have cacti developed spines and needles? Four. Where is the nutritive function of the cactus carried out? Five. Select the saguaro cactus from among the choices pictured.